Malik pedaled slowly through the quiet neighborhood, the weight of the day softened by the golden haze of the setting sun. His backpack was light, just a few leftover snacks from the food pantry where he'd spent the afternoon helping stock shelves and hand out meals. The old bike creaked beneath him with every turn of the pedals, its faded blue frame a sharp contrast against the pristine sidewalks and neatly trimmed lawns. He hummed quietly, lost in thought, until a sudden screech broke the calm. Two police cruisers came out of nowhere, tires grinding against the pavement as they swerved to block his path. The sound jolted Malik, his feet instinctively freezing on the pedals. One cruiser stopped just inches in front of his bike, the other pulled up behind. The sirens were off, but the tension in the air was immediate, loud in its own way. The driver's door of the front cruiser flew open. An officer stepped out, hand resting on his holster, his stance rigid and eyes sharp. "Off the bike. Now." The words cut through the air like a blade. Malik blinked, confused, not understanding what was happening. He looked from one officer to the other, then slowly dismounted the bike, keeping his hands visible. His voice was steady but quiet. "Officers, is there a problem? I just came from the pantry." "Don't move," the second officer barked, already circling around him. Malik raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in peace. He knew the drill. He had seen it before. Felt it in his bones before it even happened. A woman walking her dog across the street stopped, her eyes wide. She pulled out her phone and began recording. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in her neighborhood, but this felt different. Too fast. Too forceful. One officer grabbed Malik's backpack, yanked it open, rummaging through without asking. The other was speaking into his shoulder radio, describing Malik's clothes, his bike, his location, something about matching a suspect. Malik remained still, breathing slowly, heart pounding harder now. "I work at the food pantry on 3rd, he tried again, ask for Miss Karen. "I volunteer every week." But the officers weren't listening. They weren't asking questions. They were operating from assumption, from a picture in their minds that had already decided who Malik was. A breeze stirred the trees lining the street and somewhere a dog barked, but here, on this patch of sidewalk, time slowed. The passerby's phone kept recording. Another neighbor peeked from behind a curtain. Malik stood in the center of it all, calm on the outside, but inside, an ache was growing. Not of fear, he was too used to that, but of something deeper. The ache of being unseen. Misjudged. Reduced to a threat for simply riding a bike in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. And above it all, the sky turned a deeper gold, as if holding its breath. The officer with the firmer voice stepped closer, holding Malik's ID up to the fading sunlight. His partner circled behind Malik, hands still near his weapon, eyes scanning the quiet street as if expecting someone to burst from the bushes. "You match the description," the officer said flatly. "Young black male, dark clothes, riding a bike. There was a theft a few blocks from here 20 minutes ago. You're staying right here." Malik swallowed hard, not in fear, but frustration. He kept his hands in plain view, his posture relaxed, his voice steady. "I just left the shelter. I volunteer every Tuesday and Friday." "I still have the ID badge," he said, gesturing slowly toward the plastic card clipped to the collar of his hoodie. The officer glanced at it but barely reacted. He looked like a man convinced. A man who had already made up his mind. "I didn't steal anything," Malik said, quieter now. "You can check with the director. Or, call Captain Ramirez." That name, Captain Ramirez, landed in the air like a dropped stone in still water. Both officers hesitated. The one holding his ID squinted, now reading the badge properly. The other looked at Malik sharply, as if re-evaluating what stood in front of him. "Who's Captain Ramirez?" the first cop asked, tone now more cautious. "She's my mom," Malik said simply. "She's active duty Army. Please. Just call her. A long pause hung between them. One officer tapped his radio, muttering something into it. The other pulled out a phone and stepped away. Malik stood still, his heart pounding now, not because he was afraid of what they might do, but because he was afraid they still wouldn't listen. That even invoking the name of a decorated officer, might not matter. The seconds dragged. Then came the silence. Not the kind of silence that suggests calm, but the heavy, crackling kind, the kind that precedes a shift. Static flickered through the police radios. The officer with the phone froze, looking at something on the screen, his brow tightening. Malik watched them carefully. Their body language began to change. The stiffness in their shoulders gave way to uncertainty. The edge in their voices softened, replaced with confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a trace of doubt. The officer with the ID cleared his throat. Stay right here, he said again, but the command had lost its heat. Malik didn't move. He didn't need to. In the stillness, the weight of the mistake began to settle. And then, from somewhere far down the street, came a low, rhythmic sound. A vibration. At first distant, like thunder over a ridge. Then closer. A deep mechanical hum. Tires on asphalt. Engines rumbling in unison. The officers looked up. Something was coming. At first, it was just a faint tremor in the pavement beneath Malik's worn sneakers, a subtle vibration that even the officers didn't notice right away. But Malik recognized it instantly. That deep, rolling thunder wasn't from a storm. It was familiar. Intentional. Steady. The kind of sound you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. Then came the engines. From around the corner, Humvees began to appear, one, then three, then nearly a dozen, stretching down the street like a convoy of purpose and precision. Their matte green exteriors glinted in the dusky light, and their tires rolled slowly, deliberately, parting the silence of the neighborhood with the unmistakable presence of the military. The officers turned, stunned. Their confusion grew with every second. They reached for their radios, but it was too late for control. This was no accident. This was arrival. From the lead vehicle, the door opened. Out stepped a tall, composed woman in fatigues. Her stride was confident but calm, her eyes sharp with a different kind of authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Captain Ramirez. She scanned the scene quickly. The patrol cars, the scattered neighbors watching from porches, the two stunned officers, and her son standing alone on the sidewalk, his hands still visible, his posture still quiet. Her face softened the moment their eyes met. She walked straight to Malik, no hesitation, no questions. And then, she wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. Fierce and warm all at once. "My son," she said, her voice thick but controlled, "are you okay?" Malik nodded, his chin resting on her shoulder for a second longer than he meant to. "Yeah. I'm okay now." The officers stood frozen, the weight of their error dawning painfully in the presence of something bigger than themselves. One reached up to adjust his collar, suddenly aware of how small he felt. Behind Captain Ramirez, the other Humvees came to a stop. Doors opened. Soldiers stepped out, not with weapons drawn, but with calm composure. One by one, they lined the street, forming a protective wall behind Malik and his mother. Not a blockade. Not a threat. A statement. Not in anger. But in unity. A message unspoken, this one matters. He's ours. He is not alone. The street, once filled with suspicion and assumption, now held something else entirely. A quiet power. A maternal love backed by a nation's promise. And in the stunned silence, the sound of Malik's name being spoken with pride became louder than any accusation could ever be. Captain Ramirez stood with her arms still around Malik's shoulder, her uniform crisp in the evening breeze. The soldiers behind her remained silent, not out of discipline alone, but respect, for their captain, for Malik, and for the moment unfolding before them. She turned to the two officers. They stood uneasily now, their earlier certainty drained away, replaced with a hollow discomfort. But instead of anger, Captain Ramirez approached them with something deeper, purpose laced with grace. Her voice was calm. Steady. Not sharp like a reprimand, but firm like a truth long overdue. "I know you were doing your job," she began. "But sometimes, doing the job isn't enough. Sometimes, we need to stop and ask ourselves what part of us is doing the deciding, our training, or our bias." The officers said nothing. They couldn't. The words hung heavy in the air, impossible to deflect. "You saw a young black man on a bike," she continued. "And somewhere in your mind, that became suspicious. Even with a badge around his neck, even with open hands, even with kindness in his voice, you didn't see him. You saw something you were trained to fear." Malik looked down, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but she gently touched his shoulder, steadying him. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words carried the quiet power of someone who spent a lifetime breaking barriers and choosing courage over bitterness. "We have to do better," she said, turning slightly so her voice reached not just the officers but the neighbors peering from windows, the bystanders still filming, and the children clinging to their parents behind hedges. "All of us. This is not just about policing. It's about perception. It's about humanity." She then knelt beside Malik, not because he was a child, but because she wanted to meet him eye to eye, as a mother, as a soldier, and as someone who knew the burden he carried in silence. With the whole street watching, she spoke the words he didn't know he needed to hear. "Your kindness," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "your patience, your heart, that's why 50 soldiers dropped everything to come for you. Not because you're my son. But because you're the kind of person we fight for. The kind of person this country needs." She placed a hand over his chest, right where his volunteer badge still hung. "You serve this country," she said, her voice rising just enough to echo across the crowd, "not with weapons. But with heart." A quiet murmur swept through the street. Not applause. Not cheering. Just breath, a collective exhale, as if the entire block had been holding it in, waiting for someone to say what they couldn't. And in that moment, Malik wasn't just seen. He was known. Not as a suspect. Not even as a soldier's son. But as a man who had changed something in all of them, without ever raising his voice. The video made its way online that same night. Not just a shaky clip of flashing lights or shouted commands, but a quiet moment, a mother in uniform stepping out of a Humvee, embracing her son on a suburban street, surrounded by soldiers not in formation, but in solidarity. It wasn't the confrontation that people shared. It wasn't anger or outrage that caught fire. It was the stillness. The hug. The look in Captain Ramirez's eyes as she held Malik close. The way the soldiers stood. Not to intimidate, but to protect. The way they made a circle of safety around one young man who had done nothing but ride his bike home after giving his day to serve others. By morning, the video was everywhere. News outlets ran headlines about the army mom who showed up, but social media went deeper. People didn't just share it, they talked about it. About the quiet strength of Malik. About the grace in Captain Ramirez's voice. About the questions her words had left echoing. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. The two officers who had stopped Malik returned, not with excuses, but with humility. They stood beside Malik outside the same food pantry, surrounded by press and community members. And they apologized. Not with stiff statements written by lawyers, but with something raw and human. "We got it wrong," one of them said. "Not just this time, but too many times. And we want to learn." Malik didn't smile, but he nodded. Then he handed them each a box of canned goods and invited them inside. By the end of the week, they were stocking shelves together. The story continued to ripple outward. Veterans shared it. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Clergy spoke about it in sermons. It became less about race or uniforms or even justice, and more about the simple idea of showing up for someone with love instead of fear. A high school in Ohio held an assembly where students reenacted the scene to talk about bias and empathy. A sheriff's department in Arizona began a partnership with local youth volunteers. And everywhere, people began to ask a question that had no easy answer, but infinite power in its asking. What if we all showed up for each other like that? Not just with weapons or protests or policies, but with compassion. What if our instinct wasn't suspicion, but solidarity? What if power didn't mean force, but presence? In a world so often divided by fear and assumption, Malik and his mother reminded everyone watching that real strength doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes, it wears a volunteer badge. Sometimes, it rides an old bike. And sometimes, it shows up in a convoy of Humvees, not to fight, but to say, he matters. He is loved. And you need to see him. Because in the end, the strongest force isn't fear. Or even justice. It's love.